What were the stress levels back then? When did you realize that Lehman was going to be so big, and then actually it was going to take, it wasn't the symptom, but it was actually going to take the rest of the financial, crisis with it?
It's interesting, Francine. There was, from one perspective, there were a lot of warning signs. So the year before, when we had the money market troubles in the French banks, we had the asset management problem at Bear Stearns. I think we had in the summer of 2007 the large mortgage write-down of UBS in the U.S. And then, of course, at Easter in 2008, Bear Stearns was bailed out or acquired by J.P. Morgan, and it was soon after that when we first started thinking about what could be, the next shoe to fall. And of course, Fannie and Freddie and AIG and so many things happened. So in some ways, you would say we should have been prepared for it. But I don't think anyone in the world was prepared for the kind of the devastation that hit the morning after the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers and the chaos in the markets.
And Bob, this is what, because people didn't understand the interconnectedness, I guess, right, of what banks were lending to each other. Do we now fully understand it, 10 years on?
Well, I think it's absolutely correct that we didn't understand completely the interconnectedness, and I think there's a much better understanding today. I think banks are much safer and sounder, but to say we understand all the complexity of the interconnectedness would probably be a bit optimistic.
Okay, at the time, we should have seen the vulnerabilities. What do you think is vulnerable now that regulators are missing?
I think the challenge from the moment we realized there was a problem, I think the single biggest issue for elected officials was too big to fail. How can we be sure that we never again have to put public money into banks or other financial institutions? And it's easy to do that if you just make the system completely safe and take no risk. And so always the challenge has been, how do we make the system and the banks safer and sounder, while also promoting jobs and economic growth, getting lending into the economy. And I think that's been the challenge the whole way.
But are we risking a new financial crisis, or would the next crisis come from the real economy?
I think it's probably the latter. I'll never be able to predict the next crisis, but I think today banks, particularly the larger banks, are safer and sounder. I don't think there's a crisis with banks around the corner. I do think there's an interesting addition to that thinking, though, which is that if we do have a crisis in the financial markets, it is unlikely in my mind to be caused by the large banks, but it's also unlikely that the large banks will be part of the solution. If you think of the amount of risk being taken today, it's significantly less, and that's appropriate. And the ability to help in a situation like that from the big banks is significantly less than it would have been prior to the crisis.
So who is part of the solution? Is it only regulators, or does it have to be government?
Well, I think you just hit the nail on the head of what the worry is. So one of my worries is that if you look at the tremendous success of monetary policy and quantitative easing and the things that were implemented by Chairman Bernanke post the crisis in 2008, it's been very successful, but today we still have $3.5 trillion of assets on the Fed balance sheet. We still have rates below 2%. Inflation is about target. We've just put $2 trillion into the U.S. economy through tax cuts and spending in the U.S. So the thing I worry about is if there is a crisis or an accident or something that needs to be done about the financial marketplace, do we have the tools? Have we used all the ammunition from monetary policy and fiscal policy?
We also spoke to Michael Spencer, Bob, and he, in this basically, says, he was worried that Barclays wouldn't survive Lehman Brothers. Here he is.
I remember sitting there watching the Barclays share price tumble down to 50p, and actually genuinely wondering at the time, is it possible that Barclays don't survive this?
Bob Diamond, what do you remember of those days?
I think that was like the next year in 2009, and all bank stocks were very, very weak. And if we look back at that period, that first quarter of 2009 was the deepest and darkest recession that we had seen since the Great Depression. I think as we look back at it today, it lasted 3 to 6 months, but the severity of it was real.
Are we still paying the consequences of the financial crisis now? I've heard everything. You know, Nouriel Roubini was saying, well, actually, populism is because of the financial crisis. This kind of stagnant growth is because of the financial crisis. What do you see as the real consequences left?
You know, I think my worry is how do we move ourselves away from the appropriate measures that were taken around monetary policy and in fiscal policy, and how do we begin getting to a more normalized level of interest rates without spooking the markets. And against the backdrop that we're talking about, there's $8 trillion in U.S. corporate debt that will mature between now and 2020. So if you see the environment, if you kind of weigh all of those things with a significant amount of ammunition used from monetary policy and fiscal policy, a need to get rates higher back to a more normalized level, and all of the debt that is ready to mature in the next couple of years, we have a recipe for issues. And how do we manage through that, I think, is the single biggest impact of the financial crisis today.
When you say issues, Bob, is it crunch time for the economy, or is it actually a huge market correction?
Well, I think that's the question, and I think there's no question that we have to begin, continue raising rates and get back to a more normalized level, and we also have to be conscious of the impact on that, on other factors such as the maturity of debt.
Bob, muscle memory, I guess, is a great thing, unless it's the only thing you have. Is there a danger that we're over-regulating banks because of what happened with Lehman and the financial crisis, and that actually regulators are missing the next big thing?
I think, no, I don't believe that. I think there are differences, though. I think the U.S. banks today probably have recovered more than the banks across Europe. I think when you look back on the quick actions around TARP, and as you remember, the original TARP that was just mentioned in this program was about ring fencing assets. And I recall watching the TV as Congress did not approve that TARP. The second TARP, which was very effective, was about putting equity into all of the systemic banks. So every systemic bank took equity. In order to pay that back to the government, they had to clean up their balance sheet, meaning they had to pass the Fed stress test. Until that money was paid back to the government, there were really no bonuses and no dividends. And so what happened, looking back 10 years on, the banks that were probably in the most difficulty at that time, the systemic banks of Citi and B of A, are today stronger and healthier. And we haven't seen that kind of recovery across Europe.